All right, everybody, thanks so much for coming to NG Indy. I'm very excited to be here. So my name is Jesse Sanders. As was mentioned, I'm the CEO of Breebug. And this is me a couple weeks ago in Silverton, Colorado, heli skiing. Anybody heli ski here? No? All right. What an amazing adventure. So I'm a Google developer expert in Angular and web technologies. And as I said, I'm really happy to be here today. So, is that going to play? There we go. So you see here, I actually do a little thing called an Ironman. Anybody do an Ironman? All right, we got some Iron. All right, awesome. So that's been my passion lately. This is me taking some other GDEs out to go snowmobiling in Vail, Colorado. And that's a little helicopter deal there that we were riding in while we were doing our heli skiing. So we landed at 13,500 feet and then started snowboarding down. So it was absolutely insane. All right, so today, what I'm going to talk about is what I wish I would have known about NgRx before starting my project. Who right now is using NgRx? All right, quite a few. So who remembers my talk last year about I'm not ready for NgRx? Anybody see that talk? Smaller group? All right, excellent. So there's a lot of things that when we get into NgRx, there's a lot of things that I wish I would have known about before I got started, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So I've made a few mistakes. I have found myself knocked down on the mat. Anybody find themselves when they get into NgRx, they get in it a little ways and all of a sudden it's like, oh, what did I get into? Why is this not working quite the way I think? So it sounds painful. So one of the things we're going to talk about are what are the things that you need to know about NgRx and state management so that you can be successful. So anybody know what this is? Yell it out. What? It's silver bullet, right? You know what it's not? It's not NgRx. NgRx reduces complexity. It's the whole idea behind it. So I've been an engineer for about 25 years. And I've worked on a lot of enterprise class systems. And the biggest challenge that we always came up against is how to deal with complex systems, especially when we're talking about a lot of different moving parts. How do we get them to communicate together? So great. NgRx is this amazing pattern that helps us reduce complexity. But the bad news is that NgRx is also complex. Okay, it takes time to understand it, but it'll help you build amazing enterprise applications. So a couple of things to keep in mind here. It's not appropriate for small projects. Like if you want to do your tour of heroes and you want to play around with it and come up to speed with how to use NgRx, great way to do it. But if your boss is coming to you telling you that, hey, we've got this application to build, we've got a really tight timeline, it's really not all that complex, NgRx is really not the right answer. What I talked about last year about not being ready for NgRx is I would recommend using something along service with a subject. Anybody using service with a subject now? Awesome, that's great news. So service with a subject is a really easy way to enter into state management without having to go with all the overhead of using NgRx. And if you use something like a facade, it makes it really easy to then start upgrading your application to NgRx later. Hopefully, I hope that you got that from my talk last year. All right, so NgRx is not more code. What it is, it's just more structured. So currently in applications, what happens a lot of times is, let's say we're loading products. We'll be loading the same product data over and over in different components. And what we do is we go to create the new components, we copy the code from the other component, and then we move it over here, right? Does that sound familiar? Should sound familiar, because that's what most people, including myself, traditionally did. What it now allows us to do is take that code and put it into like an effect, and now it's there in one spot. So code duplication is eliminated. It's a really big point with NgRx. It allows us to eliminate the code duplication. We have all of our APIs and our effects. We have all of our selectors for how we get the data back out. How we deal with data is all within our reducers. Makes it really easy. So we have a unified API across our application. So now instead of loading products different ways between different components, now we have a unified way, we dispatch an action and we get it back. So, and we have a very simplified event model. So before in the old days, what we do is we'd have all this, you couldn't remember whether it was on scope or root scope, and I'll go ahead and emit this event and who's listening for it. And then before we know it, we have 10 different components that are all loading products because they think they are the one that's supposed to go get the product data. All right, so plan your NgRx design. I think one of the biggest things that I see is that people just jump in and start coding, right? Let's just fire up a new project and let's start putting some NgRx code in. Well, actually, what I'd recommend to you is plan your entire design. And all of a sudden you decide, I want a 5-bedroom house. How expensive is it to rip out concrete, right? Very expensive. Same thing with applications, becomes more and more expensive the further along we go. Do your design up front. It's exponentially more expensive in the future. So do not reuse actions. This is probably one of the number one things that I see people do, and they get very, very clever with how to reuse actions. They'll add additional properties and then start to inspect those properties to decide in the reducer how they're going to do things. So really what it is, don't abuse actions. Actions are really, really important, and they should be really, really simple. So actions are simple. They should convey context. So they should convey the action, and here is a payload. Here's the data that goes with that action. This allows us at a later date to be able to understand what happened in our application. So we're not left wondering who fired what happened, how did things go down, right? Actions should not contain logic. If they have logic in them, or ways to build in logic so you can use that logic in the reducer later, you're doing it the wrong way. Revisit actions, go back and relearn on what actions are, that they're just for context with data, and eliminate those things from your code. An action shouldn't be tested. That's kind of a head scratcher, right? We want to test everything. But actually, actions are so simple, all you're really testing is Angular or TypeScript. Don't waste your time on that. Test your reducers, test your effects, test your selectors. So speaking of selectors, selectors are underused. Who doesn't like selectors? Anybody? Come on, there you go. Who's not going to raise their hand no matter what I say? Rest of you? All right, there you go. I see you people over there. Cool. So selectors are way underused, and you really should be taking advantage of them. Selectors are ultra optimized, but they can also, people don't really understand them always, and so they do a few shortcuts and it gets them in trouble later. So one of the greatest things about selectors is they are composable. So what do I mean by composable? So instead of having to write one big, long, 600-line deal that goes and gets the data that I want, I can now break that into small, reusable pieces. So now I can compose selectors from other selectors. So it makes my life a lot easier, things are a lot cleaner. We also get memoization. So memoization is super important, especially as we're building more and more complex selectors to build out the data that we want, because it says, hey, look, if the underlying data has not changed, then don't go recalculate it. Don't go rerun all of this. Just go ahead, hey, here's your data. Makes it really, really fast. This is how we get performance. So they're easy to test. The great things about selectors is they're just basically functions. So we give it a state, and then we run the selector, and then we can compare it to the return state. This makes it really easy. So do not replace a selector with a combine latest. So one of the biggest things that we see where people get themselves into trouble with selectors is either within a component or within a service or a facade, they will say, okay, I'm going to get stream A and I'm going to take it and combine latest with stream B outside of using selectors. And what happens is when the data changes underneath, Now it's having to rerun that combined latest 3 or 4 times. So don't do that. Do those sorts of operations inside of your selectors, allow it to be optimized, and don't do combined latest with streams of data outside of your selectors. All right, so in RxJS, subscribe is where reactive programming ends. Anybody heard this quote before? No? This is by some really smart dude. You might see him later. His name's Michael Lackey, really good friend of mine. So reactive programming is really the next wave for Angular, in my opinion. Lots of conversations going on within the community about reactive programming. And when we're talking about NgRx, we're really, in a lot of ways, we're talking about reactive programming. Who right now is calling their API with the HTTP client, and as soon as they get the data back, they're like, let me subscribe to it and assign it to a variable. Who's doing it? All right, the other half of the room won't raise their hand, will they? No matter what. Okay. It's really, really common, and it's probably the biggest mistake that you're making. Because as soon as you subscribe, all the beauty of reactive programming is now out the window. And the beauty is you don't need to do this. So Angular is reactive so that you don't have to subscribe. So what do I mean by this? Well, one thing here that comes up is explicit subscriptions. Doing .subscribe is what I mean by that, equals memory leaks. So those of you that are subscribing, how many of you are keeping track of the subscriptions and then unsubscribing? Yeah, like, okay, a few more. All right, great. That's good, but here's the news. You don't have to do it. It's wasted code. Right? All right. Use the async pipe. This is your friend. Okay? The async pipe will do all the work for you. It will manage the subscription. It will allow you to go ahead and get the data out and then pass that down. Okay? One of the big things that I talked about last year is container presenter. Who's doing container presenter in there right now? All right, that's it? Come on, that's it? All right, so this is the #1 pattern you should be implementing in your Angular applications. It'll change from being like, hey, I'm pretty good at Angular, to I'm an expert at Angular. I cannot stress this enough. I teach this around the world. Container presenter is where the magic's at. So what do I really mean by that? Well, we have our container here. Okay, right here we got our container. And you can see I've got a customer's $, which is an observable. And this is going to be our data that's going to be assigned. This is our stream of data of customers. And then we're going to be able to pass that down to a presentation component, to its input. Now it's going to receive it just as customers, not as an observable. Okay, we're going to use async pipe to do that. So the magic really happens between here in the input and the output. So as we're passing the data from the container to the presenter, we're using the async pipe to do so. And the presenter is then emitting events back up using outputs. So we're emitting events back up. All right, so another really popular thing right now is using facades. Anybody using facades in their applications? Few? So facades are kind of nice because it allows you to decouple NgRx or service with a subject from your components. So this is a really powerful technique. This is also, though, where there's a lot of controversy because we see people doing combined latest in their facades. So that's something that we were talking about just a second ago. Please don't do that. That's going to cause you problems. But facades, really, the idea here is we can abstract away all the implementation details from the component. So the component just actually uses a service, and it doesn't know whether or not it's NgRx or service with a subject, and allows us to commingle service with a subject and NgRx within a single application. It simplifies our components. That's probably the #1 reason to do it. It also makes it easier for more junior developers. So if you're the architect on your team and you have a bunch of, let's say, mid-level developers or junior developers that don't necessarily understand NgRx, we can abstract some of that complexity away from them by using facades. Just don't abuse them. Don't do the combined latest. Don't do, try to make some funky magic going on. They're just there to help abstract stuff away and make your components more simple and make your application more reusable. So, NgRx makes it possible to track and recreate state, and we see this all the time because the Redux dev tools, right, allows us to do this, except for it's just local. So what do we do when we get actually into production? Anybody heard of LogRocket? LogRocket is an amazing tool. No, I don't work for them, but I do love it. We use this in a lot of projects. And what LogRocket does for us is it makes it easy to do this at scale. So now we're able to understand what happened on a user's machine that could be halfway around the world and be able to recreate exactly what happened based on the state that's there. So super powerful. They've got great demos available. Take a look at it. I'd highly encourage you. So, all right, so that's just kind of the basic stuff. But that's really like, those are kind of like my top 10 things that you should really be aware of when you're doing NgRx. But one of the biggest things that causes developers problems, and especially with NgRx, is nested data. So nested data causes all sorts of problems. We'll talk about here, but there's a library out there called Normalizer, and Normalizer actually allows us to take the nightmare and get ourselves back to focusing on the app. So APIs are rarely perfect. So if there's any API developers out there in the crowd, I'm sorry, but they're not perfect. They're often problematic. More often than not, we're returning far more data than we need, and often it's nested. So why is nested data a problem? Well, the big things is we end up with duplicated data, and then when we go to update that data, our reducers are overly complex because we're having to drill down through all the layers and iterate over stuff to try to find the items that we're trying to update, okay? That's really, really nasty. And so what happens is, often, is people don't break the data apart, and they just put it into the store, and then they go to update a piece of it, and they don't understand why it's updated over here, but it's not updated over there, okay? Also, the other big thing that happens is they corrupt their store, okay? Because they're no longer immutable data, they mutate it, and then it causes all sorts of a myriad of other problems. So, eliminate duplicate data by breaking them apart and putting them to individual stores. So here's an example. Right here we got blogs, right? And so a blog has an ID, has an author, a title, it has comments, and then I have commenters, which then have an author of those, right? Pretty common. But this is nested data. So we could have Paul, who's written multiple articles, and maybe Nicole's written some articles, and then Paul's commented on hers. Now, if we go to update Paul's information and put his last name on there, we got to go find every single instance where Paul is either an author or a commenter so that we can get that data updated. It's not very ideal. So along comes Normalizer. Normalizer is a great little library that was created by the original Redux team. And just for this exact purpose. And what it allows us to do is go ahead and define schemas and then break this back apart. So in this case here, I've defined a user schema. Oh, if I can get that to go. No? All right. I've defined a user schema. I've also defined a comment schema, which has a commenter of type user. And then I have an article schema, which has author was type user, and then comments of type comment array. So it works really nice. I can go ahead and define what my schema is and then call Normalizer on it, and it will go ahead and break everything apart for me. So after Normalizer runs, now I have entities, I have articles, I have users, I have comments, and they're completely broken apart. Okay, now I can take these individually and go ahead and put them into my store. So Great, so now I have it breaking apart. Now you tell me, okay, I can put it into my store, but how? How would I do that? So this is an effect. This here is a function out of an effect called load blogs. And so I would change our success block from where it's loading, calling this.blog service get all, and then I'm just mapping the results of that into load blog success. That would actually then get picked up by my reducer and go ahead and insert that data into my store for me. But in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and instead of, once I call my blog service get all, I'm going to have it call a new function called decompose blogs, and I'm going to have it call, take the data that we got back from our data call, and I'm going to have it call another function called split models. So all we're really doing here is we're taking a single action and now we're mapping it to a new action. And then we're taking the data that we're getting and we're running it through Normalizer. So the next step on this, and this gets a little bit more tricky, instead of using a map, we'll use a flat map. This allows us to take multiple actions here and go ahead and split those out into multiple actions. So single action into multiple actions, otherwise known as a splitter. Okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to, from our data, we're going to grab our blogs, our users, and our comments, and go ahead and add those to each one of the stores individually. So here's where the magic happens. So we had this little function called split models, and split models calls normalize, which takes our schema, breaks our data apart, and then we're returning a new object here called blogs. We're returning a new object that has 3 properties in it: blogs, users, and comments. And we're using the values that are coming from the dictionary, and we're just calling object values on that to strip that out and put it back into arrays for us. Okay? So this allows us to take our data and get it into the store exactly the way we need it. So fantastic. Now we have, within our application, we have 3 different stores that have normalized data. But the problem is now you need to build out the blogs page, right? So is the data in the format that you want? No, it's not. So, a couple of things here that we're going to talk about, and we're going to look at the solution for this. One, working with data collections is slow. And so if we take those arrays and we put them into our store, and then we're trying to merge the data together, we're having to iterate over things and run find operations to get them so we can put them together. So that's really slow process. It's not a big deal if we're talking about 5 records, but it's a big deal if we're talking about a couple thousand records and trying to marry those together. So who's using NgRx entity right now? Okay, if you're going to use NgRx, I could not tell you enough to use NgRx entity. This is one of the libraries I'm very passionate about. And simply what it does is it takes array-based data and it converts it to dictionary-based data. So since querying an array is really expensive, we don't really want to keep it in arrays anymore. We want to move it to dictionaries so that I can ask for it by ID and I can immediately find it. Dictionaries, then, because of the nature where my ID is the key and then my value is the object, makes real-time lookup super easy. So let's take an example here. So here's a blogs array. We're not going to worry with the fact that we actually have nested data here, but I've got a blog, it's got an ID, it's got an author, this is an array, fantastic. When I put this into, using NgRx, when I put this into the store, it will automatically change this for me. And it does 2 things. It creates an entities and an IDs. The entities is my dictionary, and you can see there my ID is 123, and so that is the key. It's also the ID on the object, and then that way, if I want to go find the blog entry that has a ID of 123, all I have to do is ask for it. It also has an IDs property, and what that does is that actually tells us what is the natural order for the objects that are in the dictionary. So that way we can recreate the exact order that we may have queried them from the database. So now in this case here, Here's our selector. We can return the blog exactly what we want. We can go ahead and get the entities and then return blogs 1, 2, 3, and that'll return the exact blog we're looking for. We didn't have to query over an array to find that record. All right, so the last part of this is complex views do not equal complex domain data. The number one reason why people don't break apart their nested data is because they don't understand how to then get the data out of the store and build it in an efficient way so that we can build the UI that we want. So just because we have a complex view doesn't mean that we should allow our data to be in the store as a complex domain model. So complex view data needs computed domain models. So remember we talked about selectors and how they're underutilized and they're super powerful and memoized? These are your friends. This is how you're going to do it. So you're going to allow your UI to define your interfaces. So in the case where we want to display blogs, we know we have a blog, it's going to have an author, and then we're going to have an array of comments. Each one of those comments has an author, and we want to build that back up. So we're actually going to create a model that, that represents that, and then we're going to use our selectors to build it for us. So we use selectors to build the view data. So what does this look like? All right, here I'm creating a new selector, and I'm going to ask for all blogs, and then I'm going to get my user entities and my comment entities. And you can see here, I'm then got my blogs, my users, and my comments, and I'm going to map across my blogs. I'm going to take and spread my existing blog. I'm going to look at my author, and I'm going to look at my comments and attach those directly to my model here. Now I can use my blog view and assign that to my view-based model, and I can instantly get the data that I want. Since it's memoized, I don't have to go back through this expensive operation multiple times in case I'm showing this in multiple places, or even if I come back to it and none of the data has changed, then it'll use that calculated value for me. So everybody asks me, like, show me, right? How do I actually do this? Well, the good news is this. I've put all this into a nice code block or a repo for you. I'll also tweet this out if you follow me on Twitter. I'll tweet this out. I'll also then get you the copy of the slides. So you have the slides, you can go back through this information and learn from it over and over. Oh, did not mean to do that. Where did my... There we go. So with that, I really appreciate your time today. This is me. I was actually doing some cat skiing, and that was a snow cat. We're way above tree line there. But thank you very much today for coming out. Thank you for coming and supporting NG India. And before I go, I just want to give Dhananjay a really big thank you for putting this on. I am also a conference organizer in Denver, Colorado, and I know how much work it takes to put this on. And so it is absolutely amazing to see so many smiling faces here in this room today, and it's because of people like DJ that go above and beyond to make events like this happen. And so again, thank you everybody. Namaste.